Imagine you're standing in the middle of the desert. The sun is burning above you. The sand stretches on forever in every direction. There's nothing around you. No road, no city, no sign telling you which way to go. And then, slowly, a compass appears in your hand. You look at the needle. It has been pointing west for decades. Steady, reliable, locked in one direction as if it could never move. But now, right now, it begins to shake. It hesitates. And then, with a certainty that surprises even the hand holding it, the needle swings, and it points east. That is exactly what is happening to Saudi Arabia. Not in a desert, not with a compass in someone's hand, but in the real world, in oil tankers changing their routes across oceans, in diplomatic handshakes in Beijing and New Delhi, in billion-dollar deals signed under the chandeliers of grand palaces, in highways being built where sand used to sit undisturbed, in factories rising from the desert floor, in trade routes shifting like rivers that finally decided to find a new course. The compass of Saudi Arabia, one of the wealthiest and most strategically powerful countries on earth, has turned. And it is pointing east. This is not a small story. This is not a footnote in someone's economics report. This is about the entire architecture of global power being redesigned, quietly, deliberately, and with extraordinary precision, right in front of our eyes. And to understand it fully, to feel the weight of what is happening, you need to go back in time, not too far, just a few decades. Because the story of why Saudi Arabia turned east only makes sense when you understand how deeply it was once anchored to the West. For most of the 20th century, the relationship between Saudi Arabia and the United States was one of the most important partnerships on earth. It was built on a simple, almost elegant exchange. Saudi Arabia had oil, more oil than almost anyone else on the planet, sitting beneath its desert in quantities that made the rest of the world envious. The United States and the West behind it needed that oil. They needed it to run their factories, fill their fuel tanks, heat their homes, and power the extraordinary industrial civilization they had built after World War II. Without Middle Eastern oil, the Western economy would have run slower, cost more, and struggled in ways that would have changed history. In return for that oil, the United States gave Saudi Arabia something that money alone could not buy. It gave it security. Real, guaranteed, underwritten with military force security. American soldiers were stationed in Saudi Arabia. American fighter jets were sold to the Royal Saudi Air Force. American naval power patrolled the Persian Gulf. American diplomatic muscle was applied whenever a threat emerged. From Iraq, from Iran, from any regional force that might destabilize the kingdom. Saudi Arabia sat comfortably under the American security umbrella, knowing that the most powerful military in the history of the world was essentially its guarantor. This arrangement was cemented further by a financial mechanism called the petrodollar. After 1974, Saudi Arabia agreed to price its oil exclusively in US dollars. This single agreement had enormous consequences. It meant that any country in the world that wanted to buy oil, and every country in the world needed oil, first had to acquire US dollars. This created a permanent, structural global demand for the American currency that reinforced American financial dominance for decades. The petrodollar was not just a trade agreement. It was the foundation of American economic power in the second half of the 20th century. And Saudi Arabia was at the center of it. This arrangement worked. For decades, it worked. Saudi Arabia grew richer than almost anyone had imagined possible. Cities rose from the desert. Universities were built. Roads connected remote villages to gleaming modern metropolises. Saudi citizens enjoyed subsidized fuel, free healthcare, and government salaries funded by oil revenues that seemed like they would never end. The West got its energy supply secured, its dollar kept dominant, and its geopolitical influence over the most strategically vital region on Earth maintained. It was, by any measure, one of the most successful partnerships in modern history. But something started to crack. It did not crack all at once. It cracked slowly, like a wall that has been standing too long, with hairline fractures appearing at first, barely visible, then widening, then impossible to ignore, no matter how hard anyone tried to look away. The first crack came from technology inside the West itself. American engineers discovered that oil and natural gas could be extracted from underground rock formations using a technique called hydraulic fracturing, what people call shale drilling. Suddenly, the United States found itself swimming in domestic energy. States like Texas, North Dakota, and Pennsylvania became oil-producing powerhouses. American imports of Saudi oil began falling. The desperate dependency that had been the original foundation of the relationship, America needs Saudi oil, full stop, started to erode. America was no longer as hungry, and when a powerful partner is no longer hungry, they become less attentive, less careful, less committed. The second crack came from politics. The West began attaching conditions to its friendship with Saudi Arabia in a way it had not done before. Human rights organizations published reports. Western parliaments passed resolutions. European leaders gave speeches. American senators wrote letters. The murder of journalist Jamal Khashoggi in 2018 brought this pressure to a boiling point. triggering sanctions discussions, arms embargo debates, and a wave of public condemnation that Saudi Arabia found deeply humiliating. For a kingdom that had spent decades as a loyal, quiet ally, being lectured publicly about governance by the same countries that had happily sold it. Weapons for 50 years felt less like principled concern and more like hypocrisy wrapped in political convenience. And then came the third crack, the deepest one, the one that changed everything. While America was pulling back, while Europe was issuing statements, an entirely different part of the world was moving in the opposite direction. The East was rising, and not gently. China was not just growing economically, it was transforming into the second largest economy on Earth, at a speed that history had never seen before. India was not just developing. It was becoming a $5 trillion economy with a middle class larger than the entire population of the United States. Indonesia, Vietnam, Malaysia, South Korea, economies across Asia were expanding, industrializing, and consuming energy at rates that made Western demand look flat by comparison. And these Eastern economies were hungry, desperately hungry, for oil, for investment, for technology, for infrastructure partnerships, for everything Saudi Arabia had to offer. And unlike the Western partners who were now attaching lectures to their deals, the East arrived with a different proposition entirely. No conditions, no public criticism, no demands about governance or political reform. Just, here's what we need, here's what we offer. Let us build something together. That offer, delivered quietly and consistently, changed the calculation inside Riyadh in a way that no Western sanction or political speech ever could. This is the moment Saudi Arabia's compass began to move. Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, the young, strategically brilliant, and extraordinarily powerful man who has been reshaping Saudi Arabia from its foundations upward, looked at the global map and saw what was coming before most Western analysts were willing to admit it. The West was slowing, the East was accelerating. And in that gap, in that growing space between a cooling partnership on one side and a warming one on the other, there was an opportunity so enormous it would define Saudi Arabia's next century. He called the domestic part of this transformation Vision 2030, a plan to reinvent Saudi Arabia's economy from the inside, reducing its dependence on oil revenue by building new industries, new cities, new forms of commerce and culture. But Vision 2030 could not succeed in isolation. It needed partners, it needed capital, it needed markets. And those things were not going to come from the same direction they had always come from. To build a new Saudi Arabia, Mohammed bin Salman needed a new geography, and that geography pointed east. The scale of what Vision 2030 envisions is difficult to overstate. Neom, the futuristic city being built on the shores of the Red Sea in northwestern Saudi Arabia, represents a $500 billion investment in a city designed from scratch, with no cars, powered entirely by renewable energy, and intended to become one of the world's leading technology and innovation hubs. The Line, a linear city stretching 170 kilometers through the desert, is one of the most architecturally audacious projects in human history. Diriyah, the historic birthplace of the Saudi state, is being restored and transformed into a global cultural and tourism destination. Qiddiya is becoming a massive entertainment and sports complex. None of these projects are being built in isolation. Every single one of them requires technology, capital, construction expertise, and eventually customers, and the largest sources of all of those things are in the East. Chinese construction firms are among the most active contractors in Vision 2030 projects. Chinese technology companies are helping build the smart systems that will run NEOM's infrastructure. Indian IT specialists are writing the software. Southeast Asian tourists are increasingly part of the target market for Saudi Arabia's new hospitality industry. Vision 2030 is not just a domestic economic plan. It is a foreign policy embedded in concrete and fiber optic cable, designed to lock Eastern partners into Saudi Arabia's future so deeply that the relationship cannot be undone by any change in political winds. Let us talk about China first, because China sits at the absolute center of this story, and the relationship that has developed between Riyadh and Beijing over the past decade is one of the most consequential bilateral partnerships in the world today. In 2024, the total trade between Saudi Arabia and China reached $98 billion US. Let that number land for a moment. $98 billion in a single year, moving in goods and energy and materials and manufactured products and chemicals between two countries that barely knew each other commercially just 2 decades ago. That is the weight of this relationship now, measured not in diplomatic language, but in the actual physical movement of ships and cargo across the Indian Ocean and the South China Sea every day of the year. But the trade figure is only the visible surface of something far deeper. Between 2005 and 2024, China invested a total of $85 billion in infrastructure projects inside Saudi Arabia: ports, roads, industrial complexes, power facilities, technology parks, Real physical things built into the Saudi landscape by Chinese companies with Chinese capital. And here is the detail that makes this number extraordinary. The majority of it, $45 billion, came after 2016. That was the year Vision 2030 launched. Before that, Chinese investment was present but modest. After that, it exploded. China did not just welcome Vision 2030, it showed up to build it. Think carefully about what that means in practical terms. Since 2016, China has been investing more than $3 billion per year into Saudi Arabia's physical infrastructure. Every year. That is not a gift, that is a bet. China is betting that Saudi Arabia's transformation will succeed, and it wants to be embedded in that transformation so deeply that the two economies become structurally inseparable. When your infrastructure is built by someone else's companies, when your industrial zones are powered by someone else's equipment, when your telecommunications networks run on someone else's technology, the relationship goes far beyond trade. It becomes architectural. On the energy side, Aramco, Saudi Arabia's state oil company and one of the most valuable companies in human history, agreed to build a $10 billion refinery and petrochemical complex in northeast China. This is a 300,000 barrel per day refinery combined with a 5 million ton per year ethylene plant. Saudi oil entering Chinese infrastructure, Saudi chemicals feeding Chinese manufacturing, Saudi capital employing Chinese workers, and generating Chinese tax revenue. This is not a buyer-seller relationship. This is co-ownership of each other's industrial future. The energy relationship is also evolving well beyond oil, which is perhaps the most surprising and significant part of the China-Saudi story. In July 2024, a Chinese firm called Envision Energy formed a joint venture with Saudi Arabia's Public Investment Fund to build a wind turbine factory inside the kingdom. This is Chinese clean energy technology being manufactured on Saudi soil. Chinese solar companies, Jinko Solar and TCL Zhonghuan, signed agreements to construct solar plants in Saudi Arabia with a combined production capacity of 30 gigawatts, enough electricity to power millions of homes. The country sitting on the world's largest conventional oil reserves is now co-building the world's renewable energy future with its biggest oil customer. That combination, oil and solar, fossil fuel and clean energy, present and future, in a single partnership is one of the most telling signals of where this relationship is actually headed. Then there's the dimension of this relationship that rarely gets discussed in polite company, but which reveals exactly how serious it has become. The military dimension. Between 2011 and 2020, China's arms exports to Saudi Arabia grew by 400%. That is not a gradual trend. That is a dramatic, deliberate expansion. Drones, surveillance systems, precision weapons technology flowing from Chinese factories to Saudi armed forces. In June 2024, Prince Khalid bin Salman, the Crown Prince's own brother and Saudi Arabia's defense minister, flew to Beijing personally to explore ways to deepen defense cooperation still further. When a country sends its defense minister to a meeting, it is not sending a diplomat. It is sending a signal. The diplomatic architecture around all of this is equally impressive. In September 2024, Chinese Premier Li Qiang visited Riyadh to co-chair the fourth meeting of the high-level Chinese-Saudi Joint Committee, a permanent bilateral governance body that manages the full spectrum of the relationship. In 2025, the two countries designated it the China-Saudi Arabia Year of Culture, launching exchanges, exhibitions, educational programs, and people-to-people connections designed to weave the societies together, not just the economies. When two countries start talking about culture, it means their relationship has crossed a threshold. It is no longer transactional, it is civilizational. There's also the matter of the petrodollar. For decades, Saudi Arabia priced all its oil in US dollars. That single fact gave the dollar its global dominance. But in 2023, Saudi Arabia began discussing, and in some cases completing, oil transactions with China settled in Chinese yuan. This is not a full shift. It is an experiment. But experiments have a way of becoming habits, and habits have a way of becoming systems. If the petrodollar begins to weaken, if Saudi Arabia gradually diversifies the currency in which it sells oil, the consequences for American financial power would be enormous. This is one of the quietest but most consequential threads in the entire story of Saudi Arabia's pivot to the east, and it connects directly to something even larger that is happening in parallel, the rise of BRICS. Saudi Arabia has been formally invited to join the BRICS group, the alliance of major non-Western economies that includes Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. While Saudi Arabia has moved carefully on full membership, its deep engagement with the BRICS framework is yet another signal of where Riyadh is positioning itself on the global board. A Saudi Arabia that trades in yuan, participates in BRICS summits, and builds infrastructure jointly with China is a Saudi Arabia that is actively constructing an alternative to the Western-led financial order, not to destroy it, but to ensure that it is not the only game in town. The Gulf-China trade relationship has now crossed a historic line. For the first time in modern history, Gulf-China trade at $257 billion has overtaken Gulf-West trade. That is not a prediction. That is not a trajectory. That is a threshold that has already been crossed, a fact already written into the ledgers of global commerce. The East has become the Gulf's primary commercial partner, and Saudi Arabia is at the heart of that transformation. But China is only one direction on this compass. Swing it slightly south, and the needle lands on India, a country of 4 billion people, the world's most populous nation, one of its fastest growing major economies, and a country whose relationship with Saudi Arabia is built not just on trade, but on something older and more human than any economic policy: people. 7 million Indians currently live and work in Saudi Arabia. Not visitors, not diplomats, residents, engineers, construction workers, IT specialists, teachers, nurses, drivers, accountants, people who have built entire lives in the kingdom, who raise their children there, who send billions of dollars home to their families every year. The remittance flows from Saudi Arabia to India run into the tens of billions annually, supporting millions of Indian households in states like Kerala, Tamil Nadu, and Andhra Pradesh. These are not statistics. These are families. And where families are connected, trade follows almost automatically. The Indian worker who spends 20 years in Riyadh returns home not just with savings, but with relationships, with knowledge of Saudi culture and business practices, with a personal stake in the prosperity of both countries. Multiply that experience by 7 million people, and you have something that no government program can build: a living, breathing network of human connection that serves as the foundation for every formal agreement signed between the two governments. In the financial year 2023 to 2024, bilateral trade between Saudi Arabia and India reached $98 billion. Saudi Arabia exported $42 billion worth of goods to India, the vast majority of it crude oil, while India sent back $56 billion worth of pharmaceutical products, engineering goods, textiles, food, and technology services. Saudi Arabia ranks as India's third largest oil supplier, delivering 35 million metric tons of crude in a single year. Indian refineries process Saudi crude. Indian power plants burn Saudi fuel. Saudi energy does not just run Saudi Arabia's economy, it runs a significant part of India's economy too. That is a dependency so fundamental that neither side can afford to allow the relationship to falter. In April 2025, Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi flew to Jeddah for a state visit. He and Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman sat across a table and reaffirmed Saudi Arabia's pledge to invest $100 billion in India, across energy, infrastructure, manufacturing, technology, and finance. Of that total, $10 billion was specifically earmarked for India's most dynamic new sectors: artificial intelligence, space technology, biotechnology, and the startup ecosystem. Saudi Arabia's Sovereign Wealth Fund, the Public Investment Fund, with over $700 billion in assets, is essentially writing a check for India's technological future. That is not trade. That is a long-term strategic bet on a country that Saudi Arabia has decided will be one of the defining powers of the 21st century. On April 22, 2025, the India-Saudi Arabia Strategic Partnership Council held its second formal meeting, co-chaired by both leaders in Jeddah. The council's agenda covered investment, energy, defense cooperation, and cultural exchange. Notice that word: defense. Saudi Arabia and India are now discussing defense together. 10 years ago, that sentence would have been implausible. Today, it is official policy. The relationship has moved from commercial to strategic, from transactional to architectural. Now push the compass further east, past India, across the Bay of Bengal, and into the vastness of Southeast Asia, and you find a third layer of Saudi Arabia's pivot that most people overlook entirely, but which will matter enormously in the decade ahead. This is one of the most dynamic economic zones on Earth, growing faster than almost anywhere else, urbanizing at extraordinary speed, building a middle class that will drive consumer demand for decades to come. Trade between the GCC, the Gulf Cooperation Council, which includes Saudi Arabia, and the ASEAN nations reached 2% of GCC total trade in 2024. The absolute number is still relatively modest compared to China or India, but the direction is unmistakable. ASEAN GCC trade is growing. Every year, more Saudi goods move to Southeast Asian markets. Every year, more Southeast Asian products arrive in Saudi ports. And at the ASEAN GCC Economic Forum in May 2025, Saudi Arabia's Deputy Minister for Investment, Sarah Al-Sayed, said something that revealed the full ambition behind this engagement. She said, Saudi Arabia sees untapped potential not just in technology, but specifically in agriculture and food security. Saudi Arabia is a desert kingdom. It cannot grow enough food to feed its population. Southeast Asia, fertile, tropical, agriculturally rich, grows food in extraordinary abundance. A partnership built on Saudi energy and Southeast Asian food is a partnership built on mutual survival. And partnerships built on survival tend to last. Indonesia is the anchor of this Southeast Asian chapter. With 280 million people, the world's largest Muslim-majority population, and an economy growing at 5% per year, Indonesia is a natural partner for a Saudi Arabia that is building industries, seeking markets, and deepening its connections with the Islamic world. Malaysia offers something slightly different, a sophisticated financial system, an established Islamic banking sector, and deep cultural ties with the Arab world that go back centuries. Singapore, despite its tiny size, is one of the world's most important financial centers, and a gateway through which Saudi investment can flow into the rest of Asia efficiently. Vietnam, one of the fastest growing manufacturing economies on earth, represents the kind of supply chain integration that Saudi Arabia needs as it builds new industrial sectors under Vision 2030. This brings us to the question that sits underneath all of these numbers and deals and diplomatic visits, the question that matters most. Why? Why is Saudi Arabia doing this? What is the real logic that connects the wind turbines and the oil refineries and the state visits and the military agreements and the cultural exchanges? Because this is not random. This is not improvisation. This is one of the most carefully designed strategic pivots in modern geopolitical history. The answer has 3 parts, and each part is as important as the other 2. The first part is economics, and it starts with an honest confrontation with reality. Saudi Arabia knows, its leaders have said this plainly and publicly, that oil will not power the world forever, not because the oil runs out, but because the world will gradually find other ways to fuel itself. Electric vehicles are already replacing petrol-powered cars at a pace that would have seemed fantastical 15 years ago. Renewable energy is getting cheaper every year. Hydrogen is emerging as a viable fuel for industrial processes. The energy transition is real. It is happening. And Saudi Arabia, which has built an entire civilization on oil revenue, cannot afford to pretend otherwise. Vision 2030 is the plan for the after-oil era. Tourism, technology, entertainment, manufacturing, renewable energy export, financial services. These are the industries Saudi Arabia is building now so that when oil's era eventually closes, the kingdom has something else to stand on. And all of those industries need customers. They need investors. They need supply chains. And the largest, fastest growing pools of all of those things are in Asia. The second part is geopolitical power. Specifically, the power that comes from not being too dependent on anyone. Saudi Arabia watched what happened to countries that relied entirely on a single powerful patron for their security. It watched how quickly that patron's priorities could shift, how conditionality could be attached to protection, how a change in administration in Washington could change the entire terms of a relationship that had seemed permanent. Saudi Arabia decided it did not want to be in that position anymore. By building deep relationships with China and India simultaneously, by engaging ASEAN while maintaining ties with Washington, Saudi Arabia creates something called strategic leverage. It becomes the country that both superpowers need. And a country that both superpowers need is a country that neither superpower can push around. This is multipolarity as a deliberate strategy, not a passive adaptation to a changing world, but an active construction of a position that gives Saudi Arabia maximum freedom of action in any scenario. The third part is something deeper than economics or geopolitics. It is civilizational. Saudi Arabia is the guardian of the 2 holiest sites in Islam, Mecca and Medina. Every year, nearly 2 million Muslims from across the world gather in Saudi Arabia for Hajj, the annual pilgrimage that is one of the 5 pillars of the Islamic faith. The vast majority of those pilgrims come from Asia. Indonesia sends more Hajj pilgrims than any other country on earth. India and Pakistan together send hundreds of thousands. Bangladesh, Malaysia, Central Asia, the global Muslim population is overwhelmingly Eastern, not Western. The communities Saudi Arabia is building economic relationships with in Jakarta and Kuala Lumpur and Dhaka are communities that already know Saudi Arabia, that have prayed toward Mecca every day of their lives, that have saved for years to make the journey to the holy cities, that feel a connection to the Arabian Peninsula that no trade agreement could manufacture because it was already there, woven into their faith. When Saudi Arabia builds an economic relationship with these countries, it is not building from zero. It is building on a foundation of shared identity that is centuries old. That is an advantage no Western country can replicate, and Saudi Arabia is using it. Now there is something crucial that this story requires complete honesty about. Saudi Arabia's pivot to the East is not a divorce from the West. It is an expansion away from dependency on the West. The distinction matters enormously. In 2025, while all of these Eastern relationships were deepening and multiplying, Saudi Arabia's ties with the United States remained active, significant, and in some areas were actually growing stronger. When Donald Trump visited the Gulf in 2025, he returned with major technology cooperation deals, renewed defense partnership commitments, and a reaffirmation of the long-standing security relationship between Washington and Riyadh. American weapons are still in Saudi arsenals. American companies are still winning contracts in NEOM and the Red Sea development projects. American diplomats are still among the most frequent visitors to the Royal Palace. The U.S.-Saudi relationship is not dead. It is not even dying. It is simply no longer the only relationship. This is the real innovation in Saudi Arabia's strategy. Previous generations of Saudi leaders faced a binary choice: the West or isolation. Mohammed bin Salman has rejected that binary entirely. He is building a Saudi Arabia that sits at the center of every major power network simultaneously: Washington and Beijing, Delhi and Brussels, Jakarta and London. Saudi Arabia is the connector, the indispensable node in a multipolar world where everyone needs access to its energy, its capital, its strategic location, its religious authority. In a world organized around a single superpower, the most powerful position is alliance with that power. In a multipolar world, the most powerful position is the one that all powers need. Saudi Arabia is building that position with extraordinary intention. The numbers confirm that this strategy is already working. Saudi Emerging Asia trade reached $172 billion. GCC Emerging Asia trade as a whole hit $516 billion. Gulf China trade at $257 billion has crossed Gulf West trade for the first time. These are not projections or hopes. These are facts already written into the trade data of 2024 and 2025. The transformation has not just begun. In many ways, it has already happened. The world is catching up to a reality that Saudi Arabia started building years ago. And the physical infrastructure being laid down right now ensures that this reality will compound over time. The refineries being built today will operate for 40 years. The solar farms being constructed today will generate electricity for 30 years. The industrial parks being established today will anchor supply chains for decades. The diplomatic framework signed today, the strategic partnership councils, the high-level joint committees, the bilateral investment treaties, will govern relationships long after the current generation of leaders has stepped back. Saudi Arabia is not just reorienting its foreign policy. It is re-engineering its physical, economic, and diplomatic architecture in ways that will outlast any individual decision-maker. That is why this story matters so much. Not just for Saudi Arabia, not just for China or India or Southeast Asia, for the entire world. Think about what the next 20 years look like if these trends continue. By the mid-2040s, Saudi Arabia's eastern trade could easily exceed $300 billion annually. The Public Investment Fund could have deployed hundreds of billions into Asian technology, infrastructure, and energy projects. Saudi students will be studying in Chinese and Indian universities. Chinese and Indian executives will be running businesses in Riyadh and Jeddah. The physical infrastructure built by Chinese firms will be woven into the daily life of millions of Saudi citizens. The food arriving in Saudi markets will increasingly come through Southeast Asian supply chains. The software running Saudi government systems will be co-developed with Indian engineers. And NEOM, if it is built as envisioned, will be a city whose very existence proves that the East-East partnership between the Arab world and Asia is not a diplomatic talking point. It is a physical civilization. When a country that controls 10% of the world's proven oil reserves permanently reorients its commercial and diplomatic relationships, the shockwave travels everywhere. When $257 billion of Gulf China trade overtakes Gulf West trade, analysts in every major financial capital on Earth start recalculating their assumptions about how the global economy works. When Saudi Arabia commits $100 billion to India and builds wind turbine factories with Chinese firms and sends its defense minister to Beijing and sits at summit tables with ASEAN leaders in Kuala Lumpur, the map of global power is being redrawn. Not with a declaration, not with a revolution, but quietly, systematically, deal by deal, and visit by visit, and factory by factory, the world is reorganizing itself. And Saudi Arabia, for the first time in its modern history, is not watching that reorganization happen to it. It is driving it. The desert is the same as it has always been. The sun still burns above it with the same merciless intensity. The sand still stretches to the horizon in every direction. But the compass is no longer spinning. The needle has settled. It has found its bearing. And it is pointing east, not because the West has disappeared, not because the old relationships have been abandoned, but because something enormous has risen on the other side of the horizon, and Saudi Arabia, ancient, resourceful, and far more strategically sophisticated than most of its critics have ever given it credit for, has decided to face it directly. Saudi Arabia looked at the world and asked one simple question: where is the growth? And the answer came back with the force of billions of people, trillions of dollars, and the momentum of history behind it. The growth is east. The future is east. The next great chapter of human economic civilization is being written east of Riyadh. And Saudi Arabia, Armed with its oil, its capital, its geography, its faith, and the most ambitious national transformation project in its history, has decided not to watch that chapter being written from a distance. The compass has moved, the kingdom has turned, and the world that follows will never look quite the same. The age of a single compass direction, a single dominant power, a single trade axis, a single financial order, is ending. And Saudi Arabia, standing at the crossroads of every major civilization on Earth, has chosen to be the country that connects them all. That is the geography of the pivot, and that geography is already the present.